Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. Out here, some men buy land to build a future. Others do it to bury a past. But the funny thing about this country is, the ground never keeps secrets for long. This is the story of a man who bought a piece of solitude, only to find it was already occupied by a ghost with a heartbeat, and a history that was coming to collect. The valley didn't have a name on most maps. The few who passed through it called it Whisper Canyon, not because of any ghost stories, but for a simpler truth. The wind never stopped here. It hissed through the narrow passes and the scrub pine, carrying a constant, lonely moan that sounded like the earth telling a sad story no one was left to hear. For Jack Mercer, that loneliness was exactly what he was looking for. He'd bought the Blackwood Creek Ranch sight unseen, paying a pittance for 200 acres and a house the land agent in Laramie had poetically described as needing a loving hand. Jack didn't care. He wasn't buying a home, he was buying an absence. The absence of neighbors, of well-meaning questions, and of the pitying looks that had followed him like ghosts ever since the fire had burned his old life to ash. When he finally rode over the pass and into the valley, he saw the land agent had been a poet. The farmhouse didn't need a loving hand, it was a skeleton. A two-story structure of sun-bleached, silvered timber, with a front porch that sagged on one side like a tired sneer. The windows were hollow eyes, most of the glass long gone. A large barn stood a ways off, listing dangerously, its doors hanging from a single hinge like a loose tooth. Surrounding the house were the ghosts of a life that had once been, a collapsed fence line, overgrown vegetable patches that were beyond recognition. A rope swing hanging from the limb of an ancient oak, turning in a slow, hypnotic circle in the ceaseless wind. The place wasn't just abandoned, it was forgotten. It was perfect. Jack was a big man, built by hard work rather than violence. His shoulders were broad and his hands were large and calloused from years of rope and timber. He had a quiet, stoic face, with gray eyes that held a deep, biting sadness he no longer tried to hide. He was 32, but felt as old as the hills around him. He spent the first day mucking out the barn, reinforcing the weakest of the beams and sweeping away decades of dust and moss droppings. He would live in the barn until the main house was habitable. It was hard, sweating work, and he welcomed it. The ache in his muscles was the only medicine that could quiet the noise in his head. As night fell, bringing a sharp, biting chill to the canyon, he built a small fire just outside the barn's gaping doors. He boiled some coffee and ate his jerky, listening to the valley's lonely symphonized sigh of the wind, the distant yip of a coyote, and the crackle of the flames. He felt a thin, fragile sense of peace for the first time in a year. That's when he saw it. A flicker of light in one of the upstairs windows of the main house. He froze, coffee cup halfway to his lips. He squinted. There it was again, a faint, wavering glow, like a candle fighting a draft. It was there for a second, then gone. His heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm. He'd assumed the place was empty. The agent had sworn it had been abandoned for 20 years, ever since the Blackwood family had died in a winter fever. Maybe it was a reflection, he told himself. The moon on a stray piece of glass. But he knew that was a lie. There was no moon tonight, and the light had held a warmth, a life, that a reflection could not. He quietly doused his fire. He picked up his Winchester rifle, which was never far from his side, and moved into the shadows. He circled the house, his steps silent on the soft earth, a habit from his days hunting in the high country. He felt foolish. It was probably a couple of drifters, seeking shelter for the night. But his gut told him otherwise. The house was silent and dark, a hulking silhouette against the star-dusted sky. He listened, but the wind swallowed every other sound. After 10 minutes, he was convinced he had imagined it. He turned to go back to the barn, and then he heard it. A sound from inside. The faint, unmistakable creak of a floorboard from the second story. Jack was not an easily frightened man, but a cold chill traced its way down his spine. He had spent the day at this place. He had walked through every room on the ground floor, calling out, his voice swallowed by the emptiness. Whoever was in there must have heard him. They had chosen to remain silent, hidden. Why? The next morning, he woke with a grim resolve. He would not live in fear on his own land. After a mug of black coffee, he took his Winchester and walked to the front door of the house. It hung crookedly from its hinges. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The air within was stale and heavy with the smell of decay and forgotten memories. Morning light streamed through the dirty windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The ground floor was empty, save for a few pieces of broken furniture, a disemboweled armchair, and overturned kitchen table. There were signs of life, now that he knew to look for them. A few faint footprints in the dust on the floor, too small to be his. An empty can of beans, tucked neatly away in the back of a pantry. He called out, his voice echoing strangely in the silence. "Anyone here? I don't mean any harm. This is my land now. I just want to talk." Only the whispering wind answered. He made his way to the base of the staircase. The steps groaned under his weight as he started to climb. Each step felt like a trespass. The upstairs was a narrow hall with 4 doors. 3 of them opened into empty, cobweb-filled bedrooms. The 4th door, at the very end of the hall, was closed. He stopped before it, his rifle held at a low ready. He could hear the beat of his own heart in his ears. He knocked softly. "Hello." No reply. He put his hand on the cold brass doorknob and turned. It was locked from the inside. "I know you're in there," he said, his voice low and even, trying to keep it non-threatening. "I'm not going to hurt you. Please open the door." Silence. Then, a voice. Faint, trembling, but clear. A woman's voice. "Go away." Jack sighed, a weary breath. "I can't do that, ma'am. This is my home. You can't stay here." "This is my home," the voice replied, with a spark of defiance. "Then you'll have to prove that to the law," he said, his patience wearing thin. "Now, either you open this door, or I'm going to break it down." He heard a scuffling sound from within. A long pause. He was bracing himself to put his shoulder through the old wood when he heard the faint click of an iron bolt being drawn. The door creaked open, just an inch. He peered through the crack. All he could see was a pair of eyes, large, dark, and terrified, like a cornered doe's. They stared out at him from the shadows of the room. "Please," the voice whispered, and this time it was filled with a pleading desperation. "Please just leave me be." Jack looked into those eyes, and he didn't see a squatter or a threat. He saw someone even more haunted than he was. He saw a hunted soul, a person hiding not just in a room, but from life itself. The sadness in him recognized the sadness in her. He lowered the rifle. He took a step back from the door. "All right," he said, his voice softening. "I won't hurt you, but we have to talk." He paused, then added, "My name is Jack. Jack Mercer." He waited. After a long moment, the door closed with a soft click. The bolt slid back into place. Jack stood in the silent hallway, listening to the wind howl around the house. He had come to this valley seeking solitude, to escape the ghosts of his past. Instead, he had found a ghost with a heartbeat. The closed door was a wall of silence and fear, but it was also a challenge. Jack had 2 choices. He could force the issue, break down the door and drag the woman out into the light, asserting his rights as the owner of the property. Or, he could try to understand. He was a man who had his own ghosts. He knew they couldn't be evicted by force. They had to be coaxed out into the open. He chose the latter. He retreated down the stairs, his heavy boots echoing in the empty house. Back outside, the world felt solid and real after the spectral tension of the hallway. He made a decision. He would treat his unseen guest not as an intruder, but as a frightened neighbor. He spent the rest of the day working, but his mind was on the woman upstairs. He split firewood, his axe rising and falling in a steady, powerful rhythm. He worked on the corral fence, replacing the rotted posts. Every so often, he would glance up at the dark and blinking window of her room. He saw no movement, heard no sound. As evening approached, he cooked his meal over his campfire, a simple stew of salt pork and beans. He made more than he needed. He poured a generous portion into a tin bowl, added a piece of hardtack biscuit, and walked to the front door of the house. He didn't go inside. He left the bowl on the top step of the sagging porch. "Left some food for you on the porch," he called out, his voice carrying on the wind. "It's not much, but it's hot." He didn't wait for a reply. He walked back to his fire, feeling self-conscious. It was a strange, silent negotiation, an offering of peace. He ate his own meal, then busied himself cleaning his gear. An hour later, he glanced at the porch. The bowl was gone. This became their new routine. Jack would work on the ranch during the day, bringing the derelict place slowly back to life. He cleared the overgrown fields, repaired the roof of the barn, and began the long, arduous task of making the main house livable, starting with the ground floor. He patched the broken windows, replaced the rotten floorboards, and built a new, sturdy front door. Every evening, he would leave a plate of food on the porch. And every morning, the empty plate would be sitting there clean. It was their only communication, a silent acknowledgement of each other's existence. He was the provider, the protector of the perimeter. She was the ghost, the silent, watchful heart of the house. He learned small things about her. He noticed that the bowl was always washed, a sign of dignity. He left a bar of soap with the meal one night, and the next day he could smell the faint, clean scent of it on the wind near the house. He left a tattered copy of a book he'd read a dozen times, Moby Dick, and it too disappeared, though he never saw it again. He named her Leela in his own mind. He didn't know why. The name just seemed to fit the whisper-thin presence she had. 1 week into this strange cohabitation, the storm rolled in. It was a fierce, late-spring thunderstorm that turned the sky a bruised purple and unleashed a torrent of rain. The wind howled through the canyon, and the old house groaned and shuddered under the assault. Jack was in the barn, securing the doors, when a flash of lightning illuminated the main house in stark, ghostly detail. In that split second, he saw her. A pale face in the upstairs window, her features etched with terror as a deafening clap of thunder shook the valley. He saw her fear, and it triggered his own. The roar of the storm, the flashes of light it brought back the fire. The smell of smoke, the heat, the screams. He squeezed his eyes shut, his hands clenched into fists, fighting the memory. When he opened them again, the face in the window was gone. An instinct, primal and protective, took over. He grabbed the heavy blanket and his lantern and ran through the driving rain to the house. He didn't bother with the new door he had built. He went around to the back, to a kitchen door that was still barely on its hinges. He found her on the ground floor. The storm had finally broken a hole in the old roof, and a steady stream of water was pouring into the main room. She was huddled in a corner, as far from the leak as possible, wrapped in a thin, ragged shawl, shivering. In the flickering light of his lantern, she looked small and ethereal, a thing of shadow and bone. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wide with fear, ready to bolt. "The roof's given way," Jack said, his voice gentle, trying not to startle her. "You can't stay in here. The whole thing might come down." She just stared at him, trembling. He held out the thick wool blanket. "Here, come back to the barn. It's dry. And it's warm." She hesitated, her fear of him warring with her fear of the storm. The house gave another groan, and a piece of plaster fell from the ceiling, splashing into the puddle on the floor. That decided it. Slowly, like a fawn taking its first steps, she stood up. She was taller than he had imagined, but painfully thin. Her dark hair was a wild, tangled mess, and her dress was a patched, threadbare thing. She looked like she hadn't had a proper meal or a safe night's sleep in years. She didn't take the blanket. She just walked past him, out the back door, and into the storm, heading for the barn. Jack followed, his lantern casting their too long, dancing shadows against the rain-swept ground. In the barn, the world was calmer. The sound of the rain was a dull drumming on the roof, the wind a muffled howl. Jack had a small fire going in a makeshift stone hearth. The air was warm and smelled of hay and dry wood. He gestured to a pile of clean straw he had laid out near the fire. "You can sleep here." She went to the spot and sank down, pulling her thin shawl tighter around herself. She still wouldn't look at him, keeping her face turned toward the fire. Jack poured her a tin cup of hot coffee, which he had laced with a little whiskey for warmth. He set it down beside her, not too close. "My name's Jack," he said again, softly. She was silent for a long time. The only sounds were the fire and the storm. He thought she wouldn't answer. Then, her voice, barely a whisper. "Leela." The name was a shock. His name, the one he had given her in his mind. It felt like a strange sort of magic, a sign that he had understood something true about her, even in the silence. "It's good to finally meet you, Leela," he said. They sat in silence for the rest of the night. He on his bedroll, she on the straw, the fire between them a warm, protective barrier. He didn't press her for answers. He didn't ask her why she was hiding in his house. For now, it was enough that she was safe, that she was warm, and that she had a name. He learned later that she had been there for almost a year. She had stumbled upon the abandoned ranch after fleeing a life she would only refer to as the darkness. She had survived on what she could forage and the few supplies left in the old root cellar. She had watched him arrive terrified, certain he was another man from her past, come to drag her back. She had watched him work, watched his quiet, steady presence, and a small, forgotten seed of hope had begun to sprout in the barren soil of her heart. The storm that had broken the roof had also broken the silence. It had forced the ghost out of her haunted house and into the light. And Jack Mercer, the man who had come to the valley to be alone, found himself with a house guest. A ghost with a name, a past she was terrified of, and a future that was now, inexplicably, tied to his own. The morning after the storm, the valley was washed clean. The air was crisp and smelled of damp earth and pine, and the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The violence of the night had given way to a fragile, beautiful peace. A similar, fragile peace had settled in the barn. When Jack woke, Leela was gone from her bed of straw. For a panicked moment, he thought she had fled back into the wilderness. Then he saw her. She was standing in the wide-open doorway of the barn, looking out at the sunrise. She was still a creature of the shadows, wary and skittish, but she hadn't run. It was a start. He rose and stoked the fire, putting the coffee pot on to boil. He didn't speak to her, sensing that the morning silence was a delicate thing, easily shattered. He moved with a quiet purpose, his familiar routine a comforting anchor in the new, and certain reality of having another person in his space. She eventually turned from the doorway and came to the fire, accepting the cup of coffee he offered her. Her hands were still trembling slightly, but her eyes, when they met his for a brief moment, held less terror and more a deep, soul-shaking weariness. "The house," she said, her voice a low rasp. "The roof. I'll fix it," Jack said simply. "It's a big job, but it can be done." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "You can stay here, in the barn. It's safe." She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the first time she had accepted anything from him without a fight, a silent acknowledgement of her own vulnerability. Thus began the next phase of their strange cohabitation. Leela was no longer a ghost in the house, she was a quiet presence in the barn. She kept to herself, finding a small, defensible corner in the hayloft which she made into her own private space. But she was there. Jack was acutely aware of her soft footsteps overhead, of the faint scent of wood smoke that clung to her clothes. His solitude was officially over. He threw himself into the work of repairing the ranch, using the physical labor to keep his own ghosts at bay. He started on the roof of the main house, a dangerous, back-breaking job. He would spend his days up there, ripping out the rotten timber and wrestling new beams into place. Leela would watch him. He would see her from the corner of his eye, a still figure in the barn doorway, observing his methodical, patient work. She never offered to help, and he never asked. The space between them was still too wide, the ground too treacherous. But she began to contribute in her own way. One day, Jack came down from the roof, exhausted and covered in grime, to find a bucket of clean, cool water waiting for him, a clean rag folded neatly beside it. Another day, he found that his meager vegetable patch had been expertly weeded and tended, the soil turned, the struggling plants given a new lease on life. He returned to the barn one evening to find his torn work shirt, which he had tossed aside, mended with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. They were small, silent gestures, a currency of care exchanged without words. She was paying her way, showing him that she was not a burden. He, in turn, accepted these offerings with a quiet nod of acknowledgement when he saw her, a silent thank you that she seemed to understand. One afternoon, a week after the storm, he was trying to hoist a massive ridge beam into place. It was a job for two men, and he was struggling, the heavy beam threatening to slip from his grasp. He grunted with effort, his muscles straining. "You will hurt yourself." Her voice, coming from directly below him, was so unexpected it almost made him drop the beam. He looked down. Leela was standing at the base of the ladder, her face tilted up, a look of concern on her face. "It's a two-man job," she stated. "Well," Jack grunted, "I'm a one-man operation." She watched him struggle for another moment. Then, with a sigh of what seemed like exasperation, she picked up the end of the heavy rope he was using as a pulley. "Tell me what to do," she said. He stared at her, surprised. But there was a look of quiet determination on her face that told him she would not be refused. He explained how to brace herself, how to pull in a steady, even rhythm. Together, inch by painstaking inch, they hauled the massive beam into place. When it was finally secured, they were both breathing heavily, their hands raw from the rope. "Thank you," Jack said, looking at her. It was the first time they had worked together, a team. "The roof will not fix itself," she replied simply, but there was a flicker of something new in her eyes. A small spark of connection. That act broke the ice. She began to help him more, her initial shyness giving way to a quiet competence. She was surprisingly strong, and her knowledge of the land was invaluable. She knew which clays were best for chinking the walls, which plants could be boiled into a natural sealant for the wood. She worked with a tireless, focused energy, as if rebuilding the house was a way of rebuilding herself. As they worked, they began to talk. The conversations were stilted at first, simple exchanges about the work, the weather. But slowly, cautiously, they began to share pieces of themselves. He learned that she had grown up in a small town in the East, that she loved books, and that she knew the names of all the stars. She learned that he had been a rancher in Wyoming, that he had a quiet, wry sense of humor, and that he was a good man, despite the sadness that clung to him like a shadow. They never spoke of their pasts. They were two people with deep and healed wounds, and they instinctively knew not to probe each other's scars. Their conversations were about the present, about the task at hand, about the future they were, together, building out of the ruins of the Blackwood Ranch. One evening, as they sat by the fire, exhausted after a long day's work, Jack found himself telling her about his wife and daughter. He hadn't spoken their names, Sarah and Emily, to another soul since the fire. But sitting there, in the quiet peace of the valley, the words came tumbling out. He told her about their small ranch, about Emily's laughter, about the night a faulty lantern had turned their home into an inferno. He spoke of his own guilt, of the what-ifs that haunted his dreams. Leela listened, her face soft with a profound, compassionate sorrow. When he was done, his voice thick with tears, she didn't offer empty words of comfort. She simply reached out and placed her hand on his arm, a gesture of shared humanity, of understanding. "Grief is a canyon," she said, her voice a soft whisper. "It is deep and dark, and you think you will never climb out. But the sun does rise." Even there, in that moment, Jack felt a flicker of warmth in the cold, empty place where his heart had been. He was not alone in his canyon. He had a guide. The ranch was coming back to life. The roof was finished. The windows were glazed. The house was slowly becoming a home. And in the process, its two broken inhabitants were slowly, cautiously, beginning to heal each other. But the world outside the valley had not forgotten them. The past, Jack knew, was never truly buried. And Lila's past, he suspected, was far darker and more dangerous than his own. The whispers in the canyon were no longer just the wind. They were the echoes of a life she had fled, and sooner or later, those echoes would come looking for their source. The rhythm of their life in the valley settled into a quiet harmony. The house, once a skeleton, was now fleshed out, a testament to their shared labor. The fields were plowed, ready for late-season planting. For the first time, Jack felt the tendrils of a future taking root. His grief was still a constant companion, but it was no longer a crushing weight. It was a scar, a part of him, but it did not define him. Leela, too, was changing. The haunted, fearful creature from the upstairs room was being replaced by a quiet, resilient woman. Color had returned to her cheeks. Her laughter, a rare and beautiful sound, would sometimes grace the valley when Jack's dry humor caught her by surprise. She still had her secrets, a deep well of pain behind her eyes that she kept hidden, but the walls around her were beginning to crumble. They had fallen into an easy partnership. They worked side by side during the day and shared their simple meals by the fire at night, their conversations flowing more easily now. A deep and spoken affection was growing between them, a bond forged in shared work and silent understanding. It was a fragile thing, a wildflower growing in the cracks of two broken lives, and both were terrified and secretly thrilled by its existence. The outside world intruded on their sanctuary in the form of a letter. A lone rider from the postal service, the first visitor Jack had seen in months, delivered it. It was from the bank in Laramie, a formal, bureaucratic notice that the final payment for the ranch was due. "I have to go to town," Jack announced that evening, a sense of reluctance in his voice. The thought of leaving the peace of the valley, of returning to the world of people and noise, was unappealing. "It'll take a few days. I need to settle up with the bank and get some supplies we can't grow or hunt ourselves." A shadow passed over Lila's face. The old fear, which had been dormant, flickered back into her eyes. "Town," she whispered, the words sounding like a curse. "I have to," he said gently, "but I'll be back in 3 days. For at the most, you'll be safe here. No one even knows this valley exists." He tried to reassure her, but he could see the terror taking hold. Her hands were trembling. "Don't go," she pleaded, her voice barely audible. "Please, Jack. It's not safe." "Lila, what is it?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. "What are you so afraid of? You have to tell me. I can't protect you if I don't know what I'm fighting." She looked at him, her eyes wide with a desperate, hunted look he hadn't seen since the first day. A war was raging within her, the desire to trust him battling against a deeply ingrained instinct for secrecy and survival. Finally, the dam broke. The story she had kept locked away for so long came pouring out in a torrent of whispered, painful words. Her real name wasn't Leela. It was Annabelle. Annabelle Lee. Her father had been a gambler, a cheat who had run afoul of a very dangerous man in St. Louis, a man named Marcus Thorne. Thorne was not a simple outlaw. He ran a vast criminal enterprise, dealing in extortion, smuggling, and what he euphemistically called contracted acquisition. He was a man of immense power and no conscience. When Annabelle's father couldn't pay his debts, Thorne had taken his payment in another form. He had taken her. For 2 years, she had been his prisoner, his ward, living in his opulent, gilded cage. He had educated her, dressed her in fine clothes, but she was his possession, a beautiful bird he kept to sing for his powerful, corrupt friends. But Thorne's obsession with her had grown darker. He saw her not just as a possession, but as his future wife, the mother of his heir. She had escaped, fleeing west with the help of a sympathetic servant, changing her name, erasing her past, living on the run, a ghost in her own life. She had finally found the abandoned ranch, a place so remote she thought she would be safe forever. "He will never stop looking for me," she finished, her voice a dead, emotionless whisper. "He sees me as his property. He is a man who never lets go of what is his." Jack listened, a cold, hard anger building in his chest. The abstract darkness she had fled now had a name and a face. Marcus Thorne. He understood her terror now. It wasn't the fear of a common criminal. It was the fear of a relentless, powerful man who saw her not as a person, but as an object to be reclaimed. "I won't let him take you," Jack said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The words were a vow, spoken with an intensity that surprised even him. In that moment, he knew the fragile affection he felt for her had solidified into something fierce and protective. He would stand between her and the entire world if he had to. "You can't fight him, Jack," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "He has an army of men. He's a monster." "I've faced monsters before," he said grimly. His trip to Laramie now had a new, urgent purpose. It wasn't just about paying for the land. It was about preparing for war. He left the next morning at dawn. Leela stood in the doorway of their new home, a small, lonely figure against the vastness of the valley. The look on her face was one of terrified resignation. "Be safe, Jack Mercer," she whispered as he rode away. Laramie was a shock to his system after months of solitude. The noise, the crowds, the frantic energy of the town grated on his nerves. He conducted his business at the bank with a grim efficiency, then went to the general store. His shopping list was different now. In addition to flour, salt, and coffee, he bought every box of .44-40 Winchester and .45 Colt cartridges the store had. The storekeeper gave him a curious look. "Expecting trouble, Mercer?" "Just like to be prepared," Jack replied noncommittally. His last stop was the telegraph office. This was the biggest gamble. He was reaching back into a world he had sworn to leave behind, contacting the only men he knew who might have information on someone like Marcus Thorne. He sent a coded message to an old friend, a former lawman turned Pinkerton detective in Cheyenne. "Need information on Marcus Thorne, St. Louis. Operations. Associates. Argent." Reply Laramie office. Mercer. He spent the next 2 days in a cheap boarding house, waiting. The waiting was a form of torture. His mind was back in the valley, with Leela. He imagined every shadow was one of Thorne's men, every gust of wind a threat. On the 3rd day, the reply came. It was short and chilling. Thorne is a snake, head of a vast network, has interests out west, known to use a ruthless enforcer named Silas the Butcher Kane. Kane and his men were last seen heading into Wyoming territory a month ago. Subject, acquisition of a runaway ward. Be careful, Jack. This is a hornet's nest. Stay safe. Jack's blood ran cold. Silas Kane. He knew the name. A vicious killer for hire, known for his brutality. A month ago, heading into Wyoming. They were already here. His trip to town, his letter from the bank, it was all a trail of breadcrumbs leading right to his door. He didn't wait any longer. He bought the fastest horse he could find and rode out of Laramie like a man possessed. He pushed the horse to its limits, his mind a whirlwind of fear and fury. He had left her alone. He had led them right to her. He rode through the night, guided by the stars and a desperate, burning need to get back to her. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a man riding to intercept a debt from the darkness, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he might already be too late. The ride back to the valley was a frantic, desperate race against a nameless dread. Every shadow seemed to mock him. Every mile felt like an eternity. Jack pushed his new horse, a powerful chestnut mare, to the brink of exhaustion, his mind consumed with images of what Silas the Butcher Kane might be doing to Leela. He cursed himself for leaving, for his naivety in thinking their sanctuary was impenetrable. He reached the pass leading into the valley just as the first light of dawn was breaking. He reined in his horse, his senses on high alert. The valley was quiet. Too quiet. The usual morning chorus of birds was absent. The wind, for once, was still. The silence was not peaceful. It was watchful, malevolent. He dismounted, tethering his horse in a thicket of pines. He would proceed on foot. He drew his Winchester, its cold, familiar weight a small comfort, and began to move down into the valley, using the terrain for cover, his every sense screaming that something was wrong. He saw the first sign of trouble near the creek. A set of fresh hoof prints, at least a dozen horses, shod with a type of shoe he recognized from his time on the outlaw trail. Chevy, durable, made for hard riding. Kane's men. They were here. His heart hammered against his ribs. He moved faster now, his caution warring with a desperate urgency. He crested the last rise and looked down at his ranch. And his world stopped. The house was still standing. The barn was intact. But there were horses, a dozen of them, picketed near the corral. And there were men. They moved with a lazy, confident swagger, the casual cruelty of predators who have their prey cornered. Some were cleaning their guns on the porch, others were sharing a bottle of whiskey by a newly built campfire. And then he saw her. Leela was tied to one of the porch posts, the same one he had so painstakingly replaced. Her head was bowed, her hair hiding her face, but he could see the raw, red chafe marks on her wrists. A large, brutish man stood near her, occasionally taking a swig of whiskey and saying something that Jack couldn't hear, but that made the other men laugh. A wave of pure, white-hot rage washed over Jack, so intense it almost made him black out. It was a rage he hadn't felt since the night of the fire. The desire to charge down there, his guns blazing, was almost overwhelming. But he fought it down. That would be suicide. It would get him killed and it would not save her. He had to be smarter, colder. He was one man against a dozen seasoned killers. He retreated back over the rise, his mind racing, formulating a plan. He was no stranger to long odds. He had been a tracker, a hunter, a man who knew how to use the wilderness as a weapon. He would not fight them on their terms. He would fight them on his. He spent the rest of the day like a ghost on the perimeter of his own land. He circled the ranch, observing, learning. He counted the men, 12, including the leader, a tall, gaunt man with a dead-eyed stare who could only be Silas Kane. He noted their positions, their routines, the placement of their sentries. He saw the overconfidence that was their greatest weakness. They believed they had won. They had the girl, they had the ranch, and they were just waiting for the rancher to walk into their trap. They weren't expecting the trap to be sprung on them. As darkness fell, Jack began his one-man war. He started with the horses. A rancher knows that a man without a horse in this country is a dead man. He crept to their picket line under the cover of a moonless sky. He didn't harm the animals. He simply took his knife and, with a few quick, silent cuts, severed every cinch strap and bridle rein he could reach. He then set them free, slapping their rumps and sending them scattering into the darkness of the valley. The ensuing chaos was his first victory. The men yelled and cursed, scrambling to find their mounts, their night vision ruined by the glare of their own campfire. It took them an hour to round up half the animals and discover the sabotage. Their mood, once lazy and confident, turned angry and paranoid. They knew he was out there now, watching. Next, Jack turned his attention to their supplies. They had piled their food and ammunition near the campfire. Using his knowledge of the wind, Jack crept to a position upwind. He had brought back a small pouch of something he'd purchased in Laramie, cayenne pepper. He emptied the contents into a dry leaf and, when the wind was just right, tossed it into the heart of their fire. The effect was instantaneous. A cloud of acrid, choking smoke erupted from the flames, carrying the pepper into the faces of the men gathered around it. They coughed and sputtered, their eyes streaming, blinded and disoriented. In that moment of confusion, Jack fired his first shot. He didn't aim for a man. He aimed for the cast iron coffee pot sitting on the fire's grate. The heavy Winchester slug hit it dead center, and the pot exploded, sending a scalding geyser of coffee and grounds over the two men closest to it. Their howls of pain and surprise added to the pandemonium. He had sown chaos and fear without shedding a single drop of blood. He had taken their transportation and fouled their camp. Now, they were angry, half-blind, and on foot, and they were terrified. The darkness, which had been their ally, was now his. From the porch, Silas Kane watched the chaos, his dead eyes sweeping the darkness. He was not a man given to panic. He was cold, methodical. "Stop your damn yelling," he roared, his voice cutting through the noise. "He's just one man. Form a perimeter. 2-man pickets, every 50 yards. He can't get through a line like that. Shoot at anything that moves." His men, professionals after all, obeyed. They formed a wide circle around the house, their rifles ready, peering into a darkness they now knew held a deadly, invisible enemy. Jack watched them form their line. This was exactly what he had wanted. Kane had spread his forces thin. He had made them stationary targets. Now, the real hunt would begin. Jack shed his heavy boots, moving in his stocking feet. He became a shadow, a whisper in the tall grass. He had a new target now. Not the group, but the individual. He would dismantle Kane's army one man at a time. He found his first pair of sentries at the edge of the woods. They were nervous, jumping at every sound. One of them lit a cigarette, the brief flare of the match a death sentence. It gave Jack their exact position. He circled around behind them. He moved with a patience born of years of hunting. He waited until one of them turned to scan the fields, his back to his partner. Jack rose from the darkness like a bear, a heavy rock in his hand. He brought it down on the back of the second man's head. The man collapsed without a sound. The first sentry heard the soft thud and turned, asking, "What was that, Jimmy?" He never got an answer. Jack was on him, one hand clamping over his mouth, the other driving the hilt of his Bowie knife into the man's temple. It was brutal, silent, and efficient. He dragged the bodies into the woods and took their ammunition. 2 down, 10 to go. The gathering storm had broken, and Jack Mercer, the quiet rancher, was the lightning. He was no longer just fighting for his home. He was fighting for the woman tied to his porch, and he was prepared to turn his entire valley into a graveyard to get her back. While Jack waged his silent war in the darkness, Leela was trapped in her own private hell. The rough hemp rope bit into her wrists, and the chill of the night air seeped into her bones. She had been forced to watch as Silas Kane and his men took over the home she and Jack had so painstakingly rebuilt, their crude laughter and casual cruelty a violation of the peace they had found. When they had first arrived, riding into the valley like a plague of locusts, her first instinct had been to run, to hide in the secret places she knew in the woods. But they had been too quick. They had cornered her in the barn, and the moment she saw the cold, dead eyes of Silas Kane, she knew her running was over. The darkness had finally caught up with her. Kane had been terrifyingly calm. He had walked around her, inspecting her as if she were a piece of livestock, a small, cruel smile playing on his thin lips. Annabel Lee, he'd said, his voice a dry rustle. "Mr. Thorne sends his regards. He's very eager to have you home. You've caused him a great deal of trouble." He had questioned her, of course. "Where is the rancher, Mercer?" he'd asked. "The man who paid for this land in Laramie." Leela had feigned ignorance, pretending Jack was just a drifter who had helped her for a few weeks and then moved on. She knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and comforting, that Jack would be back, and she had to protect him, to give him a fighting chance. She could not let them know he was the man who had laid claim to this land, the man who would surely return to defend it. Cain hadn't believed her, but he was a patient man. He had tied her to the porch post, a piece of bait in his trap. "Don't worry," he'd said, his voice laced with menace. "Your friend will show up, and when he does, we'll have a proper conversation." She had spent the day in a haze of despair, but when night fell and the chaos began, stampeding horses, the choking smoke, the exploding coffee pot, a fierce, defiant hope ignited within her. Jack was here. He wasn't dead, and he wasn't running. He was fighting. He was a ghost in the darkness, a force of nature, and he was doing it all for her. The knowledge filled her with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She began to work on her own bonds. The rope was thick and tight, but the men who had tied it were arrogant and careless. She began to twist her wrists, slowly, methodically, ignoring the pain as the rough fibers tore at her skin. She used the skills she had learned during her long flight for survival: patience, the quiet determination. Millimeter by millimeter, she created a tiny bit of slack. Outside, the night had grown quiet again, but it was a tense, heavy silence. The lazy confidence of Cain's men had been replaced by a nervous, palpable fear. They knew they were being hunted. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl, made them jump. Leela could see Cain on the porch, staring out into the darkness, a statue of controlled fury. He knew he had underestimated his opponent. Suddenly, a scream tore through the night from the far side of the perimeter. It was cut off abruptly. A few moments later, another shout, followed by the flat crack of a rifle. Then, silence again. Jack was dismantling them, piece by piece. Leela worked faster, her heart pounding in time with the distant, sporadic sounds of violence. She felt a new surge of adrenaline. She was not just a victim, a damsel to be rescued. She was a partner in this fight. She finally managed to pull one hand free. The pain was excruciating, her wrist a raw, bloody mess, but she ignored it. She quickly untied the other, her fingers clumsy but desperate. She was free. She didn't run. She slid down behind the porch railing, melting into the deep shadows. She was a ghost in her own house now. She needed a weapon. She knew where Jack kept a small skinning knife, tucked away in the woodshed next to the house. It wasn't much, but in her hands, it would be deadly. She began to crawl, moving with a slowness that was agonizing, toward the edge of the porch. The main group of men, including Cain, were at the other end, their attention focused outward, into the dark fields. Meanwhile, Jack had claimed his third and fourth victims. He was a master of this deadly game, using the landscape he knew so well to his advantage. He would create a diversion, a rock thrown into a bush, and when the sentries turned toward the sound, he would strike from the opposite direction. He was a phantom, everywhere and nowhere at once. His goal was to whittle their numbers down, to sow enough terror that their discipline would break. He knew he couldn't take them all on in a direct fight. He had to break their will. He was making his way toward the next pair of sentries when he saw it. A flicker of movement on the porch of the house. He froze, raising his rifle, thinking it was one of Cain's men. He squinted, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. And then he realized. It was Leela. He saw her slip off the porch and disappear into the shadows near the woodshed. His heart leaped into his throat. What was she doing? She was supposed to be his reason for fighting, not another soldier in the battle. But he also felt a surge of fierce pride. She wasn't waiting to be rescued. She was fighting, in her own way. She was taking her own freedom back. He had to protect her. He had to create a distraction, to draw all eyes away from the house. He abandoned his stealthy approach. He ran to a small rise that overlooked the camp from a different angle and did the last thing they would expect. He opened fire. He worked the Winchester's lever action as fast as he could, not aiming for men, but for the lanterns they had lit, for the windows of the house, for the ground at their feet. The roar of the rifle shattered the night, the muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness. "He's over here," one of the men yelled. Kane and the others spun around, firing blindly in the direction of the shots. "Get him," Kane roared. "He's trapped on that hill." Half a dozen men, emboldened by having a clear target, broke from the perimeter and charged toward the rise. This was the mistake Jack had been waiting for. They had abandoned their posts. They had abandoned their discipline. They had left their leader, Silas Kane, almost alone at the house. While the men charged his empty position, Jack was already melting back into the darkness. Lila made it to the woodshed. She found the knife, its familiar wooden handle a solid, comforting weight in her hand. She now had a weapon. She crept back toward the house, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilarating purpose. She saw the men charge off into the darkness. She saw Silas Kane standing on the porch, his back to her, watching the firefight, a cruel, triumphant smile on his face. He thought he had his men cornered. He had forgotten about the bait. Lila slipped up the porch steps, as silent as a wisp of smoke. Kane was so focused on the drama unfolding in the field that he never heard her. She stood directly behind him, the small, sharp knife clutched in her hand. This was the man who had stolen her life, the enforcer for the monster who had haunted her dreams. All her fear, all her pain, all her rage, coalesced into a single, sharp point of action. This was her moment, her choice. At the same time, Jack was circling back toward the house. He had drawn the hounds away, and now he was coming for the hunter. He saw Lila on the porch, a slim, dark shadow behind the hulking form of Silas Kane. His blood ran cold. He raised his rifle for a desperate, impossible shot. But before he could fire, Lila acted. She didn't go for a killing blow. She was smarter than that. She lunged forward and slashed the knife across the back of Kane's gun hand, severing the tendons. Kane roared, a sound of pure shock and agony, and his pistol clattered to the porch floor. He spun around, his face a mask of disbelief, to see his intended victim, the broken girl, standing before him with a bloody knife and eyes that burned with a cold, righteous fire. In that moment of shocked stillness, Jack stepped out of the darkness and onto the porch, his Winchester leveled at Kane's chest. "It's over, Kane," he said, his voice as cold and hard as a winter grave. The hunter was now the hunted, trapped between the ghost he thought he'd broken and the rancher he had fatally underestimated. The game had changed. The promise Jack had made to Lila in the dark, and the one she had made to herself, was about to be kept. The scene on the porch was a frozen-to-blow of violent potential. Silas Kane stood trapped between them, his face a contorted mask of rage and disbelief, clutching his bleeding, useless hand. Lila was a statue of defiance, the bloody knife held before her, her eyes locked on the man who had underestimated her. Jack was the specter of death at the edge of the light, the barrel of his Winchester a cold and blinking eye. The sound of the firefight in the fields began to die down as Kane's men realized they had been shooting at a ghost. Confused shouts drifted back towards the house. They would be returning soon. Time was running out. "You," Kane snarled at Lila, spitting the word like a curse. "I should have broken you when I had the chance." "You tried," Lila replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the terror she felt. "You failed." Kane's gaze shifted to Jack, his eyes burning with a cold, murderous hatred. "Mercer, the quiet rancher. Thorne will hear about this. He'll send an army. He'll burn this whole valley to the ground to get what's his." "She's not his," Jack said, his voice a low growl. "And this is my valley. The only thing that's going to be buried here is you." Footsteps pounded in the darkness. The men were coming back. "Jack," Lila warned, her eyes darting toward the sound. This was the moment, the turning point. Jack knew he couldn't fight Kane and all his returning men at once. He had to end this, now. He stepped forward, his rifle still trained on Kane's chest. "Lila, get in the house. Bar the door." "No," she said, her voice fierce. "I'm not leaving you." "That wasn't a request," he said, his voice hard, but his eyes pleaded with her. "I can't fight them and worry about you. Please." For a heart-stopping second, she hesitated. Then, with a look of profound, agonizing trust, she backed away, slipped inside the house, and the heavy bar Jack had installed slammed into place. Now it was just the two of them on the porch. The approaching men were only seconds away. "Just you and me now, Butcher," Jack said. Cain, despite his wound, was not a man to be underestimated. He was a cornered wolf. With a savage roar, he lunged, not at Jack, but to the side, kicking over a heavy wooden bench and sending it crashing toward Jack, a desperate, clumsy attempt to create an opening. Jack sidestepped, but the move forced him to lower his rifle for a split second. It was all Cain needed. He charged, his good hand reaching for the knife tucked in his belt. He was a brawler, a brute, and he was trying to close the distance, to turn this into a fight of muscle and steel. Jack didn't have time to bring the rifle back up. He swung it like a club, the heavy wooden stock connecting with Cain's shoulder. The blow was solid, but Cain barely flinched. He crashed into Jack, and the two men went down in a tangle of limbs, wrestling on the wooden porch. The Winchester skittered away, out of reach. Cain was a whirlwind of vicious energy, his knees and elbows flying. He was bigger, heavier, and fueled by a lifetime of brutal violence. He landed a solid punch to Jack's jaw, and Jack's head snapped back, his vision filled with stars. Cain pressed his advantage, his weight pinning Jack down. His good hand fumbled for his knife. Jack saw the glint of steel and knew he had only seconds. He bucked, using all his strength, and managed to roll them over, but Cain was still on top. "I'm going to carve you up, rancher," Cain snarled, his face inches from Jack's. His breath fell with whiskey and hate. "And then I'm going to take my time with her." That was his mistake. The mention of Leela ignited a reserve of strength in Jack he didn't know he had. It was the same primal fury that had carried him back into his burning home all those years ago. With a roar that was more animal than human, he shoved upward, creating a sliver of space. He brought his knee up hard into Cain's groin. Cain gasped. They are rushing out of him, his body arching in pain. The momentary lapse in his attack was the only opening Jack would get. He slammed the heel of his palm into Cain's nose. There was a sickening crunch of breaking bone and cartilage. Cain howled in pain and rage, blood pouring down his face. He staggered back, momentarily blinded. Jack scrambled to his feet, gasping for breath. He looked for his rifle, but it was too far away. At that moment, the first of Cain's men burst from the darkness and onto the porch. He saw his leader, bloody and staggering, and the rancher, readying himself for another attack. The outlaw raised his pistol. From inside the house, there was a deafening boom. The window next to the front door shattered, and the outlaw on the porch cried out, clutching his shoulder as he was spun around by the impact. Leela. Jack had left a loaded shotgun, his father's old 10-gauge, mounted over the fireplace. She had used it. The shot, and the unexpected attack from the house, stunned the other approaching men. They faltered, seeking cover. The distraction was all Jack needed. Cain, still reeling, made a desperate lunge for his fallen pistol. He was fast, but Jack was faster. Jack dove, not for a weapon, but for the man himself, tackling him around the waist. Their momentum carried them to the edge of the porch. For a moment, they teetered there, a grotesque, struggling silhouette against the night sky. Then, with a final, desperate heave, Jack pushed them both over the edge. They fell hard, crashing to the ground in a brutal, jarring impact. The fall knocked the wind out of both of them. Jack, landing on top, recovered first. He rolled off Cain and scrambled back to his feet. Cain lay on the ground, dazed, the fight knocked out of him. The remaining outlaws, seeing their invincible leader beaten and broken on the ground, lost their nerve completely. This wasn't a fight anymore. It was a slaughter. They had no horses, and their leader was down. Survival became more important than loyalty or pay. One by one, they began to melt back into the darkness, firing a few parting shots before running for their lives. Soon, the valley was quiet again. Jack stood over the groaning, defeated form of Silas Cain. The front door of the house creaked open, and Leela ran out, the heavy shotgun still in her hands. She ran to Jack's side, her eyes wide with fear and relief. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm all right," he said, though his body was a mass of aches and bruises. They stood together, looking down at the man who had brought so much terror into their lives. The reckoning was over. The butcher had been beaten, but the man who had sent him, Marcus Thorne, was still out there. This battle was won, but Jack and Leela both knew, with a heavy certainty, that the war for their future was far from over. The aftermath of the fight was a landscape of surreal, echoing silence. The last of Cain's men had fled into the night, leaving their dead behind. The valley, which had been a haven of peace, was now littered with the brutal evidence of their war. Jack stood over Silas Cain, his chest heaving, his body screaming in protest from a dozen bruises. Cain was trying to push himself up, his face a bloody mask, his eyes still burning with a defiant, impotent rage. Leela moved to stand beside Jack, the shotgun held steady. Her presence was a silent statement. "We are in this together." "It's done," Jack said, his voice rough with exhaustion. He looked at Cain, a man who represented everything he had come to the valley to escape. Killing him now would be easy. It would be justice, of a sort. But as he looked at Leela, at the strength and resolve in her face, he knew that more violence was not the answer. Their future couldn't be built on a foundation of more graves. "Get up," Jack growled at Cain. He bound Cain's hands with a length of rope from the porch, his movements efficient and grim. He then tended to the man Leela had shot, a young outlaw with more fear than malice in his eyes. The wound was in his shoulder, bloody but not fatal. Jack tied him up as well. "What are you doing?" Leela asked, her voice a whisper. "I'm ending this the right way," Jack said. "There's a U.S. Marshal in Cheyenne, a man I trust. We're going to turn them over to the law." He looked at her. "We can't build a life here if we're always looking over our shoulder. Thorn needs to be dealt with, not by us, but by the law. Cain is the key. He can testify against Thorn, bring his whole empire down." It was a risk. It meant leaving the valley again. It meant facing the world they had both tried to hide from. But it was the only way to truly be free. Leela nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and a deep, biting trust in him. "All right, Jack. The right way." They spent the rest of the night in a state of weary vigilance. Jack locked their two prisoners in the root cellar, a secure, windowless dungeon. He and Leela sat on the porch, nursing their wounds and their exhaustion, the shotgun and rifle resting between them, watching the sun rise on their blood-stained land. The next day was a grim, necessary chore. They buried the dead outlaws in a single and marked grave at the far end of the valley. As they shoveled the last of the dirt, a profound sadness settled over Jack. He had come here to escape death, only to bring more of it to this quiet corner of the world. "This is the price of peace, isn't it?" he said, more to himself than to Leela. "Sometimes," she replied, her voice soft. "Sometimes, to have a garden, you must first pull the weeds." Her simple, profound wisdom settled him. She was right. This violence had not been of their choosing. It had been a necessary act of survival, of defending their home. They decided Jack would make the trip to Cheyenne alone. It was a 3-day ride, and the valley was too vulnerable to be left unguarded. Leela, who had proven herself a capable and fierce defender, would stay behind with the prisoners. "You're sure about this?" he asked her, the thought of leaving her again a knot of anxiety in his stomach. "I am not the same woman you found hiding in that room, Jack Mercer," she said, and her voice held a newfound strength, a steely confidence. "This is my home. I will defend it." He left her with the rifle, the shotgun, and enough ammunition to fight a small war. Their goodbye was not one of tears, but of a quiet, profound understanding. He took her hand, his large, calloused one covering hers. "I'll be back," he said. It was a solemn vow. "I know," she replied. The ride to Cheyenne was a stark contrast to his frantic flight from Laramie. He rode with a heavy heart, but also with a sense of purpose. He was no longer running from the law or his past. He was riding toward it, seeking it out as an ally. He found Marshal Thompson in his dusty office, a man as weathered and unyielding as the landscape. Thompson was an old friend of Jack's father, and he listened patiently as Jack laid out the entire story from the fire that had destroyed his life, to the ghost in the house, to the final, bloody battle in the valley. When Jack was finished, Thompson was silent for a long time, chewing on his unlit cigar. "Marcus Thorne," the marshal finally said, his voice a low rumble. "We've been trying to get a hook into that son of a bitch for years. He's slippery, rich, powerful. But this could be it." He looked at Jack, his eyes sharp. "A witness like your Leela, Annabelle Lee, and Thorne's own enforcer, willing to talk to save his own skin. This is the best chance we'll ever have." The marshal agreed to Jack's plan. He would deputize a posse of his best men and ride back to the valley with Jack. They would take custody of Kane and the other prisoner and begin the long, slow process of building a federal case against Marcus Thorne. "You're doing the right thing, Jack," Thompson said, clapping him on the shoulder. "But you know this won't be easy. Thorne won't go down without a fight. He'll have lawyers, off judges, and men will come looking for your witness. You and that woman. You'll be living with a target on your backs for a long time." "We've been living with one already," Jack replied grimly. "The difference is, now we won't be alone." As Jack and the marshal's posse prepared to ride out, a sense of cautious optimism settled over Jack. He had faced the darkness and survived. He had made a choice not for vengeance, but for justice. He had paid a terrible price for his peace, but now, finally, he could see the possibility of a real, lasting future on the horizon. A future with Leela, in the valley they had claimed and consecrated with their courage. But first, he had to get back to her. And he knew, with a cold certainty, that the hornet's nest he had stirred was not yet done stinging. The journey back to the valley with Marshal Thompson and his 5 deputies was a tense and silent one. They rode hard, a tight, professional unit, their faces grim. Jack's sense of optimism had faded, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. The marshal's words echoed in his mind, "Thorne won't go down without a fight." He had a terrible feeling that the fight might already be coming to them. They crested the final pass at sunset on the second day. Jack's eyes immediately went to the house. A thin tendril of smoke was rising from the chimney. A good sign. It meant there was a fire. It meant Leela was still there. But as they drew closer, Jack's unease grew. The valley was too still. There was no sign of Leela tending the garden, no movement in the barn. A primal instinct, honed by a lifetime in the wild, screamed that something was wrong. "Hold up," Jack said, raising a hand. The posse reined in their horses. "What is it, Jack?" Marshal Thompson asked, his eyes scanning the ranch. "I don't know," Jack said. "It's just a feeling." He dismounted and moved forward on foot, his Winchester in his hand, the deputies fanning out behind him. They approached the house with caution, their guns drawn. The front door was slightly ajar. Jack pushed it open. The main room was empty. A fire crackled in the hearth, and a pot of stew simmered over it, filling the room with a savory aroma. A half-finished piece of mending lay on the table next to Lila's sewing basket. It looked as though she had just stepped out for a moment. But the root cellar door, a heavy, reinforced door in the floor, was open, and a cold dread washed over Jack. He and the marshal peered down into the darkness. It was empty. The prisoners were gone. And then they heard it. A woman's voice, raised in a cry of defiance, coming from the old, dilapidated barn. "Leela," Jack breathed. They ran. They burst into the barn just in time to see the final act of a drama that had begun moments before their arrival. Leela stood in the center of the barn, her back to a stall. She was holding a pitchfork, its sharp tines leveled like a spear. Her face was pale, but her eyes blazed with a fierce, cornered fire. Facing her were their 2 prisoners, Silas Kane and the young outlaw. Kane's hands were free, and he held a rusty hay hook, a vicious, curved piece of metal, in his good hand. The young outlaw was behind him, looking terrified. And standing with them was a third man. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored city suit that looked absurdly out of place in the dusty barn. He had silver hair, a neatly trimmed mustache, and a face that was handsome in a cold, reptilian way. He held a small, silver-plated derringer, and it was aimed directly at Lila's heart. Jack didn't need to be told who he was. The arrogance, they were of absolute power. It was Marcus Thorne. "So," Thorne said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that dripped with condescension. "The prodigal rancher returns. And he's brought the law. How predictable." "Thorne, it's over," Marshal Thompson said, his Colt leveled at the man in the suit. "Drop the gun." Thorne smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. "I think not, Marshal. You see, I have what you might call leverage." He gestured with the derringer toward Leela. "Annabel, my dear, you have led me on a merry chase. Did you really think this rustic little fantasy could last? Did you think this farmer could protect you from me? He's a better man than you will ever be." Leela spat, her knuckles white on the handle of the pitchfork. Jack pieced together what had happened. Thorne must have been closer than they thought. He had tracked Kane's party, arriving at the valley just hours before them. He had found his men gone, and had easily overpowered a lone woman, freeing his enforcer. "Drop your weapons," Thorn commanded, his voice hardening. "All of you, or the first bullet finds her heart." And then Mr. Mercer, my man Kane will take a great deal of pleasure in showing you just how long a man can scream. It was a stalemate, a standoff in the dusty, hay-filled barn. Jack and the deputies had their guns on Thorn and Kane, but Thorn's derringer was an undeniable threat. Jack looked at Leela. He saw the terror in her eyes, but he also saw an unyielding strength. She subtly shook her head, a minute gesture that only he would understand. "Don't do it." She was willing to die rather than be his pawn. "There's no way out of this for you, Thorn," Jack said, his mind racing, looking for an angle, any advantage. "You're surrounded." "I have a way out," Thorn said calmly. "I have her. She is my way out. We will ride out of here, and your men will escort us to the territorial line. Once we are safe, I will release her." Perhaps. It was a lie. They all knew it. Once Thorn was clear, Leela would be his prisoner again, and Jack would be a dead man. The tension stretched, humming like a high-voltage wire. The barn was a powder keg, waiting for a spark. The spark came from the most unexpected place. The young outlaw, the one Leela had shot, the one who had been a reluctant participant all along. He looked from the cold-blooded monster that was his employer, to the terrified but defiant woman with the pitchfork, to the grim-faced lawmen. He made a choice. With a choked cry, he lunged, not at Leela, but at Thorn, grabbing for the arm that held the derringer. "No more," he screamed. The derringer went off with a sharp crack, the bullet going wild, splintering a roof beam above them. For a split second, everyone was frozen in shock. In that second, Silas Kane saw his chance for revenge. He ignored the lawmen, ignored his boss. His world had narrowed to one man. With a savage roar, he charged at Jack, the hayhook raised high. And in that same second, Leela acted. She didn't hesitate. She didn't scream. With Thorn's attention diverted by the young outlaw, she lunged forward, driving the pitchfork with all her strength, not at Thorn, but at the charging form of Silas Kane. The sharp tines hit him in the side, punching through his leather vest. He stopped his charge, a look of utter surprise on his bloody face. He looked down at the pitchfork, then at Leela. He opened his mouth to say something, but only a gurgle of blood came out. He collapsed to the floor. The standoff shattered into chaos. The deputies opened fire. Thorn, shoving the young outlaw aside, turned and fired his second barrel at the marshal, who returned fire. Jack, ignoring the gunfight, dove for the Winchester he had dropped at the door. He came up with the rifle as Marcus Thorn, bleeding from a wound in his shoulder, made a break for the back of the barn, trying to escape into the twilight. "No, you don't," Jack growled. He didn't fire to kill. He fired at the ground in front of Thorn, kicking up a spray of dirt and splinters, forcing him to stumble and fall. Before Thorn could recover, Jack was on him, the barrel of the Winchester pressed against his temple. The barn fell silent, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. The young outlaw was on the floor, groaning from a bullet wound in his leg. Silas Kane was dead, and Marcus Thorn, the untouchable criminal mastermind, was on his knees in the dirt, the last ghost of their past, finally cornered. Marshal Thompson walked over, his Colt smoking. He looked at Thorn with a grim satisfaction. "Marcus Thorn," he said, "you are under arrest for kidnapping, murder, and a list of other crimes so long it'll take a week to read it." Thorn looked up at Jack, his handsome face twisted into an ugly sneer. "This isn't over, Mercer. You have no idea what you've done." "Yes, I do," Jack said, his voice quiet but filled with an iron certainty as Leela came to stand beside him, her hand finding his. "I've started my life." The rest of Marcus Thorn was the silent, final crack that brought a corrupt empire crumbling down. With Silas Kane dead, and the young outlaw singing like a canary to save his own skin, Marshal Thompson had everything he needed. Thorn's web of influence, built on fear and bribery, unraveled quickly when its spider was trapped in a federal jail cell. The trial was a sensation, and Edible Lee's calm, dignified testimony was the final nail in Thorn's coffin. He was sentenced to life in the federal penitentiary, his power broken, his name reduced to a cautionary tale. Jack and Leela returned to the valley a month later. They rode over the pass not as fugitives, but as free people. The valley welcomed them, the wind in the pines sounding less like a mournful whisper and more like a welcoming sigh. The ranch was as they had left it, a silent testament to the violence it had witnessed. The graves at the end of the valley were a stark reminder of the price they had paid for their peace. But the house, their house, stood strong, its new roof and glazed windows catching the afternoon sun. In the months that followed, they worked to erase the last of the shadows. They scrubbed the bloodstains from the porch floor. They repaired the bullet holes in the walls. They worked not with the frantic energy of survival, but with the slow, steady rhythm of people building a life. The valley, which had been a refuge from the world, slowly became their connection to it. They bought a small herd of cattle, their brands a simple gem intertwined with an ALS symbol of their new partnership. They planted an apple orchard on the hill overlooking the house. They were no longer hiding. They were growing. The quiet, broken man who had arrived in the valley seeking only to be left alone was gone. In his place was a man who laughed more than he spoke, whose gray eyes, when they looked at Leela, held a deep and abiding love. The fire that had taken his first family had left him with a terrible scar, but Leela had shown him that scars could heal, that a heart could learn to beat again. And Leela, the ghost from the upstairs room, had finally found her home. She was no longer Annabelle Lee, the prisoner, or Leela, the fugitive. She was simply Leela Mercer, a woman of quiet strength and fierce loyalty, whose knowledge of the earth made their small corner of the world bloom. The darkness of her past was still a part of her, but it no longer defined her. It was simply the long, dark road she had traveled to get here, to this life, to this man. One evening, a year after the battle in the barn, they sat on the porch of their finished house. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and rose. The zichu being jide thung majak kasa chow, zoin trong langio bubitiasai. From the newly built corral, they could hear the soft lowing of their cattle. The valley was filled with the sounds of life. Leela leaned her head on Jack's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her. They sat in a comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. "Do you ever miss the silence?" she asked softly. Jack thought for a moment. He remembered the profound, crushing loneliness he had once mistaken for peace. "No," he said, his voice filled with a quiet contentment. "I've learned that silence is just the absence of noise. Peace is what happens when the noise in your own heart finally stops." He looked at her, his love for her shining in his eyes. "You stop the noise for me, Leela." She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that still had the power to take his breath away. "We stopped it for each other." They were two broken people who had found each other in the ruins of their lives. They had faced down their ghosts, both internal and external, and had emerged not unscathed, but whole. The ranch was no longer a place of isolation and whispered sorrows. It was a home, built not just with timber and nails, but with courage, trust, and a love that had been forged in the crucible of the Wild West. The foundations were laid, and they were strong enough to last a lifetime.